And Kirk Cousins appears to have bounced back as he does. Vikings Twitter shut up briefly about the play of Kirk Cousins, but it was impressive to note that he did look a little bit more confident. He did look better. I don't know if his reads were better, but he did end up looking a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, he seemed more controlled in the pocket, and part of that might just be because he was under pressure 30% of his snaps, which is really remarkably low, one of the lowest in his tenure as a Viking. I think there was one game last year where he wasn't pressured as much, but 30% is really remarkable over the course of a year, at least over the course of the 2018 season. If he's pressured at a 30% rate for the entire year, that ranks fifth best among all quarterbacks in the NFL last year. So that's really great to see, and that might be part of the reason he was more composed and calm in the pocket. He definitely did go through his reads and was able to push the ball a little bit downfield when he needed to, average 8.3 yards per attempt, had a touchdown, had a high completion rate, and all that. And so, he's basically asked to manage the game because the Vikings got to an early lead very quickly, but an early lead quickly, that's kind of redundant, but they got to an early lead, and he was kind of part of it, right? The one touchdown. So, good game from him. I don't know how meaningful it is. I mean, there's a lot you can take from a game like this, even though it kind of resists, exploration just because of how mismatched the teams were. But, it's difficult specifically to have Cousins takes. Like, it's good he didn't panic. That's kind of a low bar. We didn't want to see him kind of spiral. We didn't want to see him struggle. That's true, but, whether or not this means anything positive as opposed to it prevents us from reading negative things, those are kind of two different realms of analysis. And yeah, we're not reading negative things, and that's, a takeaway given what happened in the Packers game. But we don't know if we've learned anything about his ability to perform in situations where he needs to perform. So that's going to be a test we're going to see next week. We're going to have a guest on to talk about it. It's going to be the normal guest. It's Lauren Cox. So we're going to talk about that. But
you just want him on because he has the world's greatest Twitter handle.
Yeah, at Cox Sports One. Yes. Phenomenal. It's the best. But yeah, good from Cousins. Is it meaningful? In some ways, yes, but mostly no. We'll kind of see if that bears out against a tougher opponent in a more important game. But yeah, I mean, I liked seeing it. He got through his reads. He was relatively accurate. Missed a couple of throws that got away from him. They weren't impactful. Didn't fumble. Great. So
important.
Yeah. So hooray.
Hooray. So Kirk Cousins played better, and Dalvin Cook and the run game looked spectacular. It looked almost like the Raiders were not built to be able to stop the run at all.
You say that, but that's kind of all they were asked to do in the offseason in terms of the way they built their team. So that's kind of funny. They prioritized a defensive end who could stop the run more than rush the passer. They got two linebackers who can't cover and can only stop the run. And despite that, Dalvin Cook manages 6.9 yards per carry on 16 carries, 110 rushing yards. There it is. Plus one touchdown, two touchdowns on the ground, some number of touchdowns on the ground.
It happened anyway. It was a thing.
Yeah. And he did a great job. Great after contact. Didn't need to be as good after contact in this game as he was in the last game. Lower percentage of his yards came after contact. Something like 49 of his 110 yards came after contact, which is still a relatively high amount for a running back, but relatively low given his experience in Minnesota. So really good to see his play. And I think you can actually draw something from what he did just because we got to see kind of different kinds of plays that he was able to excel in. So last week, he's bouncing first week he's bouncing a ton of runs instead of following the initial read or the initial design of the play. Week 2, he's excelling, but a lot of it's kind of wide. And now we're seeing him play inside, outside, seeing him play split zones and stuff like that. So a full kind of gamut of rushing plays that he was able to excel in. Small creases he was able to exploit, which I think a lot of people have been talking about. Oh, you can just find the narrowest crease and explode through it. But, as kind of tired as that analysis is, it's also true. And we got to see a lot of it in that Raiders game. So had the ability to shed a bunch of tackles again and push through contact, but importantly, avoid initial contact in the first place. So Cook is now making a good case for being one of the top running backs in the league. I think Vikings fans kind of always felt that he could earn that kind of respect to be a top 5 back in the league. That's always difficult because as a fan, a lot of people will say, hey, my running back, not a lot of people know about him, but he's secretly a top 5 guy. I mean, Aaron Jones is kind of the same way in Green Bay, where Green Bay fans say, hey, he's really underrated. He's actually quite good. But, we don't get to see a lot of him. And Lions fans will say the same thing about Kerryon Johnson. Like, hey, he missed some time, but, his rookie year was really phenomenal. And now Vikings fans get to kind of see their version of that replicated on a national stage where, Brian Westbrook, former Eagles running back, is saying that he thinks Dalvin Cook is the best running back in the league. The numbers bear it out. He's got the highest yards per carry in the league. I think he has the highest number of expected points per carry in the league. If not, he's second. And then, he's third in yards after contact per attempt. He's number 1 in PFF grade. He's making a really good case for being the best running back in the league, and I think we saw why in the Oakland game. And even though he averaged just under 7 yards per attempt, 6.9, he actually reduced his total yards per carry versus last game, which was 7.7. So he's having a really phenomenal year. Broke a record or set a Vikings record for having 3 consecutive games at the beginning of the season with 100-plus yards. No Vikings running back has ever done that, despite having some pretty good ones in their history. I mean, Adrian Peterson known to be kind of a slow starter. But, you go back all the way to like Chuck Foreman and Robert Smith and the incredible history the Vikings have had at running back. And that's never happened before. But Dalvin Cook did it, and he's doing it on not necessarily a ton of carries. Again, in this game, 19 carries, not like 25 or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, the offense seems to be revolving around him. I would say it's not revolving around him as much as people kind of want to read into it, just because they've gotten out to these leads. But the fact that he's had such a heavy workload in situations where defense expect him to get the ball and he's been able to produce, that's all really phenomenal stuff.
And let's not forget the important aspect of this, that he's being asked to, at the end of games anyway, just, grind it out and hold on to the football, and he is doing just that. This isn't a guy who appears to have a fumble problem. This is somebody who is holding onto the ball and making sure that the time does in fact drain off the clock.
Right, yeah, I remember it was either last year or his rookie year, there was a concern about drops, which he didn't have at Florida State. Last year, there was a concern about fumbles, which he didn't have at Florida State. And so far, neither of those concerns have materialized this season, which I think makes sense. I think that we just had small samples for him because of injuries, where a particular concern cropped up, and then we didn't just have kind of a long period of time to average that out and tell us, hey, this isn't actually a problem, like we suspected given kind of the resume of his career. So now we're not seeing drops from him. We're not seeing fumbles from him as we expected, but that's important because that's kind of a big part of what rounds out a good running back. So yeah, he's securely holding on to the ball in situations where the defense is doing more to kind of force a turnover than get a tackle because it's late in the game and they're behind. And also, he's still getting a bunch of yards in situations where his primary job is to run the clock. A 4-yard run on 1st and 10 is a huge victory in that situation. And he's still getting like 7 or 8 yards on those runs.
And he's catching the ball, and he's doing a hell of a lot of good things for the offense. But in case you haven't seen him play before, this appeared to be a bit of a coming out party for Irv Smith Jr., who is a backup tight end who was all over the field and became a good target for Cousins.
Yeah, yeah, you could say this was his coming out party, 60 yards or something like that. And actually, he should have much more, but a lot of it was called back on that penalty we were talking about at the beginning of the show, where he should have something like 75 or something like that. 72. I think he should have 72 yards, and then he lost 12 of them because of that penalty. So actually a really phenomenal performance. A lot of it was on plays that he ran at Alabama, so I wouldn't say that this performance is sustainable going forward. And obviously, I don't think anyone's expecting him to average 60 yards a game from here on out. That's not what I mean by it's not sustainable. Obviously, that's just not going to continue because the Vikings have such much more interesting targets to throw to when they do throw the ball, whenever that is. But I think that we're not likely to see all of these plays always available to him because he has a relatively limited repertoire and he's adding to it as time goes on. So I'm not saying that, we won't see him kind of reemerge later in the season or that he won't even get many yards in these upcoming games, but rather I don't think we're going to see this explosion again just because he's running literally the exact same stuff he ran at Alabama and teams will probably close down on it sooner rather than later. That said, really good to see because the fact that he can do the stuff that he did in Alabama tells us immediately that some parts of his games do translate. And that's a really important part because if you can't even do the stuff that you did in college, what are you doing? I mean, that's where a lot of, these gadget players, and he's playing a lot like a gadget player, have busted in the NFL. So if he can at least do that, that's really good news. And if he doesn't continue to develop as a tight end, he will continue to be an asset because he's already a really good run blocker, which the Vikings didn't even anticipate. And that's really good to see. Plus, he has the ability to kind of get downfield or move across the formation and generate a bunch of free yards in the flat. So he's always going to be an option for the Vikings if this continues to be who he is. Plus, he's got all this upside where I think he might be able to recapture later in the season the kind of things that'll allow him to be a 60, 70-yard guy.
And the other thing I want to mention about the offense is the play of the offensive line. And it wasn't great by any stretch of the imagination, but this was pretty good. And the Vikings, correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't give up a sack.
Yeah, they didn't give up a sack. And like I said, they only allowed a 30% pressure rate. Both, I think that you're right. Great results, probably good play. Like I wouldn't say they played remarkably out of their minds or anything like that, either in the run game or as pass protectors. But they played much better than they did against the Packers. Mind you, the Packers obviously have this really astounding defensive line and the Raiders kind of don't. But I mean, this is a really great start. You want them to play really well against defensive lines that don't have a ton of talent, because otherwise, I mean, then you're really having a discussion about whether or not they're one of the worst offensive lines in the league, which, I mean, they're still part of that discussion. I mean, Pro Football Focus just released some offensive line rankings for week 3. The Vikings rank, I think, like 24th. So they're just kind of out of that territory as being one of the worst offensive lines in the league. But, I think the Vikings, they're striving to get that offensive line to 15th. I think that's the goal right now. And more performances like this, or, level of play like this, I think that'll move them in that direction, because while the offensive line did make mistakes and allowed some backdoor pressure, allowed, some tackles for loss to emerge, or potential tackles for loss were not for Dalvin Cook to kind of emerge and not sustain some of these run blocks. I think kind of, if they continue to play at this level, and then, lose more against higher level defensive lines and win more against, lower level offensive or defensive lines, I think they're moving towards that kind of 15th level. And I think that that's where you can get kind of comfortable, because I think Cousins has an ability to kind of operate in that situation. He's not Deshaun Watson, where he's just kind of constantly be pressured and find ways to make it look good. He needs that supporting cast. We've talked about it a lot, but in particular, I think that he needs to, get into a rhythm, and that rhythm is much easier when pressure isn't coming immediately. So, I'll say Riley Reif, another really great game. Bradbury, I think, is improved. I would say we're not at a scenario where we can say, he's getting better because he improved against a much worse defensive tackle unit. But this is a good sign, and, take it with you. Concerned about Josh Klein's concussion. Hopefully he'll be available for the game against Chicago. But, and Dakota Dozier didn't play very well in his stead. But, Klein has continued to play well for 3 games. That's really good to see. And really, your concerns are kind of localized to Pat Elflein and Garrett Bradbury. And if Bradbury does improve, if this game is a sign of improvement, having one problem offensive lineman is a lot better than a lot of teams get to. So this offensive line is in a better spot. They didn't play brilliantly. I don't think anyone expects them to, but they played well enough for Cousins to manage a pocket and pressure rate. A lot of that has to do with the quarterback. And if pressure's not coming immediately, then the quarterback, if they can get rid of the ball quickly, can manage or control the pocket. And if the offensive line can play well enough for Cousins to at least control the amount of pressure he receives after 2.5 seconds, that's really good.
I was going to ask if our center had a better PFF grade for this game or not. There were a couple times that he got burned, but I did see a few blocks that he threw that he was able to work it.
Yeah, he had a really remarkably bad PFF grade, but it was better than his grades the past 2 games. So, that tells you, A, how bad his grades were in the prior 2 games, but also, You know, he's improving. I think he's still like the lowest graded center or whatever, which that makes sense given kind of